I thank His Excellency the Secretary General for his statement. I'll now make a statement in my capacity as President of the United States. Mr. Secretary General, heads of state and government, distinguished representatives, thank you for being here today. In the nearly 70 years of the United Nations, this is only the 6th time that the Security Council has met at a level like this. We convene such sessions to address the most urgent threats to peace and security. And I called this meeting because we must come together as nations and an international community to confront the real and growing threat of foreign terrorist fighters. As I said earlier today, the tactic of terrorism is not new. So many nations represented here today, including my own, have seen our citizens killed by terrorists who target innocents. And today the people of the world have been horrified by another brutal murder of Hervé Goudel by terrorists in Algeria. President Hollande, we stand with you and the French people, not only as you grieve this terrible loss, but as you show resolve against terror and in defense of liberty. What brings us together today, what is new, is the unprecedented flow of fighters in recent years to and from conflict zones, including Afghanistan and the Horn of Africa, Yemen, Libya, and most recently, Syria and Iraq. Our intelligence agencies estimate that more than 15,000 foreign fighters from more than 80 nations have traveled to Syria in recent years. Many have joined terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda's affiliate, the Nusra Front, and ISIL, which now threatens people across Syria and Iraq. And I want to acknowledge and thank Prime Minister Abadi of Iraq for being here today. In the Middle East and elsewhere, these terrorists exacerbate conflicts. They pose an immediate threat to people in these regions. And as we've already seen in several cases, they may try to return to their home countries to carry out deadly attacks. In the face of this threat, many of our nations, working together and through the United Nations, have increased our cooperation. Around the world, foreign terrorist fighters have been arrested, plots have been disrupted, and lives have been saved. Earlier this year, at West Point, I called for a new partnership to help nations build their capacity to meet the evolving threat of terrorism, including foreign terrorist fighters. And preventing these individuals from reaching Syria and then slipping back across our borders is a critical element of our strategy to degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL. The historic resolution that we just adopted enshrines our commitment to meet this challenge. It is legally binding. It establishes new obligations that nations must meet. Specifically, nations are required to prevent and suppress the recruiting, organizing, transporting, or equipping of foreign terrorist fighters, as well as the financing of their travel or activities. Nations must prevent the movement of terrorists or terrorist groups through their territory and ensure that their domestic laws allow for the prosecution of those who attempt to do so. The resolution we passed today calls on nations to help build the capacity of states on the front lines of this fight, including with the best practices that many of our nations have approved yesterday and which the United States will work to advance through our Counterterrorism Partnerships Fund. This resolution will strengthen cooperation between nations, including sharing more information about the travel and activities of foreign terrorist fighters, and it makes clear that respecting human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law is not optional. It is an essential part of successful counterterrorism efforts. Indeed, history teaches us that the failure to uphold these rights and freedoms can actually fuel violent extremism. Finally, this resolution recognizes that there is no military solution to the problem of misguided individuals seeking to join terrorist organizations, and it therefore calls on nations to work together to counter the violent extremism that can radicalize, recruit, and mobilize individuals to engage in terrorism. Potential recruits must hear the words of former terrorist fighters who have seen the truth. that groups like ISIL betray Islam by killing innocent men, women, and children, the majority of whom are Muslim. Often it is local communities, families, friends, neighbors, and faith leaders that are best able to identify and help disillusioned individuals before they succumb to extremist ideologies and engage in violence. And that's why the United States government is committed to working with communities in America and around the world to build partnerships of trust, respect, and cooperation. Likewise, even as we are unrelenting against terrorists who threaten our people, we must redouble our work to address the conditions, the repression, the lack of opportunity, too often the hopelessness that can make some individuals more susceptible to appeals to extremism and violence. And this includes continuing to pursue a political solution in Syria that allows all Syrians to live in security, dignity, and peace. This is the work that we must do together as nations. These are the partnerships we must forge as an international community. And these are the standards that we now must meet. Yet even as we're guided by the commitments that we make here today, let me close by stating the obvious. Resolutions alone will not be enough. Promises on paper cannot keep us safe. Lofty rhetoric and good intentions will not stop a single terrorist attack. The words spoken here today must be matched and translated into action, into deeds, concrete action within nations and between them, not just in the days ahead, but for years to come. For if there was ever a challenge in our interconnected world that cannot be met by one nation alone, it is this: terrorists crossing borders and threatening to unleash unspeakable violence. These terrorists believe our countries will be unable to stop them. The safety of our citizens demand that we do. And I'm here today to say that all of you who are committed to this urgent work will find a strong and steady partner in the United States of America. I now would like to resume my function as President of the Council, and I will now give the floor to the other members of the Security Council. I begin by giving the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Goodluck Ebele.
President Obama addressing the United Nations Security Council. I'm joined by Jim Sciutto, Christiane Amanpour, Jake Tapper. Jim Sciutto, it's easy to be skeptical, as the President said, about promises made on paper here. We've certainly seen a lot that the UN has promised that they have not been able to deliver on. In theory, what does this resolution really mean?
This was, at least on paper, a very strong statement. I have a copy of one of the final drafts of it. It has very strong legal language here, requiring nations, not asking them, not urging them, but requiring nations to, one, prevent the movement of terrorists, prevent the movement of fighters from their countries to places like Syria. Two, to address radicalization at home, to help prevent young men and women from being radicalized so they join these groups and attempt to join fights in places like Syria. But three, as well, requiring nations to make it illegal to fund and recruit them. You have a lot of countries, Qatar included, but also Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, where you have charities, or at least masquerading as charities, when in reality they're funding money and fighters to these groups. They can't just turn a blind eye to this. They have to make it criminal, and they have to pursue it. I think it is important that this was adopted unanimously, even with a country like Russia, a country that the U.S. has some very serious disputes with now, for instance, in Ukraine, but Russia as well. They have a radical problem. They've got issues with Islamic extremists in Caucasus. This is something where the U.S. and Russia can see eye to eye. China as well, often a country that will veto resolutions that the U.S. sponsors. China in Xinjiang province. It has its own problem with Islamic extremism. This is something like ISIS where countries that often differ can agree, frankly, that they have to address it. And the President said in his comments there that this is legally binding. Now, you and I know that sometimes people break the law of the UN, but at least in words, this is a very strong movement here. And another point that both the President and Ban Ki-moon made there is that in Syria alone, 80 countries have sent fighters there, 15,000 foreign fighters, 80 countries. This is not just a Qatari problem. It's not just a Saudi problem or a Syrian problem. It's an American problem. You've got 12 Americans who've gone to go there, British, French, you name it.
Right.
And they're now if they follow the letter of the law, including the spirit of the law, they're addressing it.
But Jake Tapper, I mean, even the countries that are involved in this coalition that the U.S. has put together to fight ISIS, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and others, have in the past and still are in many ways funding Salafist groups, funding extremist groups.
That's right. So the question is, how on earth is this going to be enforced, considering the fact that so many of the madrasas from which a lot of these foreign fighters are first introduced to the concepts, the Salafist concepts, that these actions that are being committed by ISIS are, in fact, in the name of God, are, in fact, holy. How on earth is the Obama administration, the UN Security Council, going to ensure that these countries stop the financing of the madrasas, to say nothing of the extremist groups? That's going to be a tall order. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk of this since 9/11, and still that financing continues in madrasas in Pakistan and elsewhere. So that's going to be a big challenge. But you have heard President Obama, as we were discussing before his remarks, Anderson, talk more about the ideology that fuels terrorist groups such as ISIS and others more today than I've heard him at any other time. So I do think that has to become something he talks more about. You heard him say just now that the people of ISIS betray Islam. A week ago, he said the Islamic State is not Islamic. ISIS is not an Islamic organization. A lot of discussion and debate about that because obviously its appeal is that it is the purest form of Islam, which is why President Obama said today that it was Muslim communities in particular required to stand up and rebut that and refute that, Anderson.
And Christian, one of the other things he just said, and interesting for a president who is now leading a war against radical Islam in the form of ISIS and other groups, saying that there is not a military solution here.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And to what Jake said, you know, these people pretend to be the purest of Islamics. Well, of course, if you go back to the actual time of the Caliphate, that was a much different Islam than you're seeing ISIS. They were much more tolerant even than the Christians at that time. So it's a complete and utter misnomer. To that end, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon today said they are non-Islamic, non-state. And you'll see that even rhetorically, the Arab and Muslim leaders and people have started to say, not in my name. There is a viral YouTube campaign, ordinary Muslims around the world saying they do not speak in my name. Leaders are saying we're not even going to call them Islamic State, ISIL, ISIS, no matter what. We're going to call them Daesh, and you're going to hear more of leaders saying that. But to the point of funding, I think that's really crucial as well. These foreign fighters, you know, Secretary Kerry said that he's sure that these Arab countries are going to have to do that. But of course, the proof will be in the pudding. I get to speak to the Emir of Qatar tomorrow, and I'll put this to him. But in terms of stopping foreign fighters, you know, the French foreign minister told me this week, and also the British are talking about this, you know, take away their passports, take away their IDs, have the communities start to reach out to us, the government, tell us when there are problems, when their kids go abroad. They know that people in their communities are missing. Report it back to us. He said we have to educate people about the cult, the murderous cult that they are going into when they go there, particularly young girls, he said. And the French foreign minister saying to me, young women who we've seen extraordinarily, way different to post 9/11. Right now, young women are going to join ISIS thinking that they're somehow going to find the meaning of life, only to be dragooned into prostitution, sexual slavery, mass rape, all kinds of inhumane and barbaric treatment. So education is also vital. But also, Anderson, as the president said, eventually it demands a political solution and an economic solution.
And the difficulty, of course, for countries to identify those who may go off to fight in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere in jihadist causes, when you have even many who have left from the United States, their family members who have been interviewed subsequently said, we had no idea my son was even thinking of doing this. We thought they were heading to Turkey to study, only to find that they wind up in Syria or in Iraq. Coming up, the U.S. says an al-Qaeda cell was planning an attack on the U.S. homeland, and now a new report suggests that group suddenly went dark. Details on that next. Plus, we're getting new information about a fourth hostage beheaded by Islamist militants. This is CNN's special live coverage ahead.